Right, I'm going to open the questions up to the floor now, and there are some roaming mics. So if you put your hand up and a mic will come in your direction. If I could ask you to tell us who you are and then ask a question, and preferably questions and not speeches or statements. Thank you very much. If we take the gentleman in the fourth row.
Thank you. Charles Waters, member of Middle Temple. In the opening address, Dominic Grieve used the phrase, should we be turning our backs on our neighbours? I have a difficulty with that because I don't believe that's what the Brexiters are saying. I believe, having listened extensively to a number of their speakers over an extended period of time, that what they're advocating is collaboration and interdependence.
Yeah, quite right.
Dominic, do you want to answer that?
In my view, we will be turning our back on our neighbours. We've engaged in a collective exercise to create within the European Union area, as it now is, firstly a single market in goods and services, not completely accomplished, but on the way to being achieved. An area of freedom of movement so that the exchange of people along with goods can take place to enable people to better themselves. And in addition to that, cooperation in a wide range of other areas which we have chosen to do with them. The argument is we might continue areas of cooperation if we leave. I don't suggest that that may be impossible, but the decision we take on the 23rd of June will completely revolutionize our relationships with them. They have their own problems, their own electorates, their own challenges, some of them doubtless self-inflicted, others which are just the product of the difficulties they face. That we will be withdrawing from that collective enterprise, and I think we will pay, I won't say a price, I think our standing with them will be substantially diminished as a result. And I think that will affect our interests and actually make the achievement of any deal thereafter of the kind which appears to be what the Brexiters are putting forward much harder to do. And this, as I say, is against the background of a world which seems to me to be an increasingly dangerous place. So from my point of view, certainly as chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, it strikes me that this is a high-risk issue. And can I just say one thing? None of us can predict whether the United Kingdom in 15 or 20 years' time will be better off in or out. It's impossible. You know, my constituents keep on saying to me, tell us the facts. I say, well, this is all about a risk assessment. It's about a risk and benefit assessment, a cost-benefit analysis, and I approach it in that light. And I see major costs to if we decide to go, and the benefits I find very opaque, very difficult to discern. And I'm absolutely sure from the old work I do that the cost in terms of the reputational cost to the United Kingdom and the cooperation that we've built up, and part of which is entrenched in the EU mechanisms, will be severely damaged. And that's why I think that we do turn our back on our neighbours, and our failure to understand their point of view is something which worries me. And we should keep it in mind, because as I say, it's our national self-interest, but their success is actually in our national self-interest as well.
Lord Howard?
Well, I think the questioner had it absolutely right. Of course we want to collaborate and cooperate with our friends in the European Union. But they have a different vision for the future than we do. Many of them really want ever closer union. They want the kind of greater unity which the ECJ mentioned in the decision that was referred to earlier. They want to move towards a United States of Europe. We don't share that vision, and so it's much better for us to be honest with them and for us to continue to collaborate with them and to be friends with them without being part of the current structures of the European Union. Now, I want to say a word about the kind of arrangements that we might have afterwards. And I suggest you apply a simple test whenever that question is raised. What would be in the interests of the remaining European Union? Take trade. Germany sells 1/5 of its total motor car output into this country. This country would be the biggest market of the European Union if we were to leave. So it is clear clearly in their interest to come to a sensible trading arrangement with us. Take security. Dominic mentioned two eminent people with previously held positions in the security field. I can mention Sir Richard Dearlove, also former head of the MI6, and the former head of Interpol, who said we'd be better off out. But again, look at whose interest it would be in to continue the security sharing arrangements. We have the best intelligence services in Europe. They get much more help from us than we do from them. If you take the European arrest warrant, for example, I was in favour of the European arrest warrant. The other countries of the European Union use it 10 times as often as we do. They get 10 times as many of their citizens arrested in this country as we do in their countries. It's clearly in their interest to continue with these arrangements. What we'd be regaining is our democracy, our self-government, and the ability to take decisions for ourselves.
Thank you. Another question from the floor. Gentleman in the front, Gordon.
Many thanks. Gordon Nardell. I'm, for my sins, chair of the EU Law Committee of the Bar Council. I'd like to ask the panel about their views of the national debate so far. The House of Lords European Union Committee back in March said this: the debate leading up to the referendum should be of a quality and breadth proportionate to the importance of the decision. It should be wide-ranging and inclusive, based on accurate information. Do the panel, excluding perhaps tonight, or maybe even including tonight, think that the debate so far has lived up to that mark? And if not, who's to blame?
Joanna?
No, I don't. And I look back on the debate that we had in Scotland during our independence referendum 2 years ago. Now, admittedly, we had a much longer run-up, but we had an informed debate. And one of the reasons for that was that the Scottish Government produced a white paper, a very detailed white paper called Scotland's Future, detailing their vision of what an independent Scotland would look like in all sorts of different areas. Now, there was much controversy about the proposals and disagreement, but there was a blueprint for what an independent Scotland would look like, which we were able to debate and discuss. The Leave campaigners have produced nothing like that. The gentleman who asked the question before said that he envisaged a relationship of collaboration and interdependence. But what does that mean? We are deeply entwined with the European Union. We've been in a common market with them for 40 years. I was a wee girl of 9 years old the last time we had a referendum about Europe. We've been in for a long time. And during that time, we have committed ourselves more and more to what is a very complex arrangement. The Leave campaign are not able to tell you what will happen in the event of leaving. So I think that's one of the reasons we haven't had an informed debate. The other reason we've not had a well-informed debate is that at least one side of the argument has got away with telling a blatant lie over and over again. This is the business of the £350 million billion pound figure on the side of the bus. Now, most of you will have watched the ITV debate last week and will know that the National Office of Statistics and a parliamentary committee has said that that information is clearly wrong. And you can read chapter and verse of that, go back and see what the Remain campaigners said in that debate last week. But I also think that the Remain campaign has been remiss in being so negative in its campaigning. When I spoke just now, in my own little way, in 6 minutes, I tried to put forward some positive arguments for remaining in the European Union. Remain have instead tried to scare the public with all sorts of dire warnings of what might happen in the event of the United Kingdom leaving Europe. Now, I can tell you from the lesson of the Scottish referendum that whereas that might win the vote in the short term, I am living proof, sitting here as I do, representing Alistair Darling's old seat in a very middle-class Edinburgh constituency that was not seen as natural SNP territory. I am living proof of the fact that the Scottish referendum was won for no by scare stories, but the argument has not gone away. We are still debating independence in Scotland, and the backlash of resentment from many no voters, it was no voters who voted me in my seat, many no voters about the scare stories has resulted in the rise of the SNP and the issue not going away.
Martin, an informed debate?
I'm disappointed by the quality of the debate. I certainly am. And if I can sort of balance the partisanship on the panel, in my mind, there's no doubt in my mind as to where the principal blame for the stand of the debate lies. And frankly, it started off with the Remain camp's propaganda blitz on David Cameron's so-called renegotiation exercise. Total misrepresentation of what that agreement contained and what it did. Now, we have the advantage, or the majority of us here who are at the bar or lawyers, have the advantage of being able to assess the truth and falsity of these claims ourselves. We, on the Lawyers for Britain website, have got a detailed critique of the 36 pages of the summit deal, explaining what it contains and, more importantly, what it does not contain. It was billed as being a major change, giving the UK a special status in Europe as protecting the city against Eurozone overreach. There was an argument as to whether or not technically it was legally binding. Actually, it doesn't bind the European Court of Justice, that's completely clear, but that's a completely secondary point, because even if its provisions were legally binding, they wouldn't achieve anything. The Eurozone governance provisions explicitly say our emergency break is a right to call another meeting of the Council of Ministers, but they explicitly say it does not confer on any member state a right to a veto. We are just as exposed, our financial services industry is just as exposed to Eurozone overreach as it was the day before that renegotiation. And the problem is we have had, I'm afraid, the Remain faction within the government has been intent on a propaganda barrage instead of attempting to actually inform the people in a balanced way of what the pros and cons are.
Dominic?
All politicians, as I know, are given to a degree of hyperbole. And I, for one, found this campaign very depressing in many of its aspects. But in a funny way, Martin's comments highlight for me some of the difficulties. I hope, applying my mind as a lawyer, I happen to disagree with him about the value of the Brussels Agreement, which David Cameron came back with. I believe, along with a number of other lawyers, including some who know a great deal about the subject, that actually there was some real meat in it. It represents some significant concessions by our European partners. It is legally enforceable. It is a binding treaty, like anything else that we do. Things like, for example, splitting directives if they affect Title V, one of the subjects which I've taken cases to the European Court of Justice. It's there. And I just disagree with Martin's analysis. But there's, I think, a wider issue. I don't doubt the sincerity of the views being expressed by people who are advocating Brexit. I can understand some of them. I happen to disagree with the analysis and with the likely consequences, because I've applied my own mind to this as a cost-benefit exercise. But I do get angry, I think, at the suggestion that I as a Remainer, are being somehow insincere in my own views, manufacturing concerns which I actually myself don't believe exist, for example. I do have very real concerns about what the immediate economic cost is going to be if there is a Brexit vote on the 23rd of June. I think this country is likely to go into recession this autumn, that there will be a rise in unemployment, and I happen to think that the government's revenues will go down at a time when the public finances are extremely constrained. Now, if the Brexiters were saying, you need to leave, and in Churchillian mode saying it's so important to us but we have to promise you blood, toil, tears and sweat, then I would accept that. But this issue has simply been glossed out, and I'm constantly being told that it's wrong to raise it because none of these things will happen. I can only give my best risk assessment. I can't say for certain what will, but I think myself it's a high risk. So there's a real problem, because instead of actually concentrating on the issues and arguing over risk, which I think is central to this, risk and benefit, we simply end up chucking, frankly, insults at each other. And that is not very helpful to have an informed debate. And that's the single thing which has worried me the most about this. And I have to accept that the Remain campaign is not blameless in this respect either. But I do worry about that fundamental issue. People must be allowed to express both their hopes and their concerns about the future if people are going to make an informed choice on the 23rd of June.
Lord Howard?
Well, look, no one's suggesting that people shouldn't be allowed to express their concerns, but their assessments can be disputed, and that's what the argument's about. And there are economists who say that our economy will be liberated and we will be better off outside the European Union. I happen to agree with them. Dominic disagrees with them. I remind you of my quotation from John Kenneth Galbraith. I would simply say this in direct answer to the question. If you're comparing the level of debate in this referendum to some Socratic discourse or the kind of argument that takes place before the Supreme Court, it doesn't measure up. But if you're comparing it to the kind of argument we normally have at general elections, it's not all that different.
Another question from the floor? Going to ask for the gentleman halfway down there in the aisle. Yep.
Jack Macaulay, member of Lincoln's Inn. I have a question for the Remain side. You've emphasised strongly that we should stay in the EU to reform it, and you've both conceded that it is not a perfect institution. Will you please give me a reason to be optimistic about the ability of the institution to reform itself, given that, for example, it still engages in practices such as moving the Parliament to Strasbourg once a month at vast expense, at a time long past, a time when anyone's defended that practice. So if it can't even do little things like that right, why should I be optimistic about its ability to do the big things right? And by the way, I would very much like to be optimistic.
My view as to why I think it will reform, is partly because I think it's going to have to reform. My own contacts, and I travel quite extensively in Europe, also persuade me that in fact there is a growing will and understanding of the need for reform in many of our partner states. The Eurozone, I don't think, can survive in its current form unless there is substantial change. And to my mind, that's one very good reason for staying in. Because as we are protected from some of the more difficult, and I have to say, greater mistakes that have been made in in the EU's development, I think we are in a good position to influence that, but doing that from the inside is going to be much easier than doing it from the out. And if we're outside, these problems facing the EU are still going to continue. Now, I'm not quite sure what my colleague Michael Gove wants. He seems to think in sort of Stalin fashion that you want to, break the eggs to create the omelette, and it would be a very good thing if the EU collapses. I must say, I just find that an extraordinary view to take. Do we want the attendant financial and economic chaos that would go with its collapse, and which would clearly have a direct effect on us? I just don't understand that. And so for those reasons, I think that there is scope for reform, and I think that my impression, I can only give it, is that many of our EU partners know that that reform has come out, and actually, if we can get the right answer on this referendum, I think that this process of debate we've had may well be a very substantial help to achieving it. And I'm a believer in holding a referendum. I should make that quite clear. I believe there is a democratic deficit, and I think it's been of great value to have this debate. But I still hope that the outcome is that we remain.
If I could pick up on what Dominic has just said, I think there is an appetite for change in the European Union at present, and a recognition that it hasn't handled two major issues well, and those two major issues are what has happened in Greece and the refugee crisis. It has been a major failing of the European Union that there hasn't been an adequate response to the refugee crisis in Europe. But I think there's great pressure on the member states from within, from non-governmental organisations and from ordinary citizens to address that problem properly. And again, I think there's widespread recognition in Europe that the way that Greece has been handled was not appropriate and was not really in the spirit of the European Union. Like Dominic, I think there will be reform because there has to be reform because of these, and change because of these major issues facing Europe, facing the European Union. I also think the fact that Britain was able to negotiate some sort of deal, I perhaps don't think the deal was quite as great as Dominic says it is, but I think the fact the Prime Minister was able to negotiate some significant changes is perhaps an indication of a willingness to adapt and reform in order to save the Union. And I think the fact that we've had this debate in the United Kingdom, and as it seems at the moment, teetered on the edge of leaving, if we decide to stay, I think our colleagues in the Union will take very seriously the fact that we almost left. And as I said earlier when I was speaking, we have the opportunity to lead the European Union next year when we have the presidency of the Council. And if we in Britain feel that there's such a need for reform and change in the Union, then surely it is our duty to lead the way.
Lord Howard, it seems to be being said on to my right that reform, yes, but reform from within. What do you say to that?
No chance. Like the questioner, in an ideal world, I would have preferred to remain in a genuinely reformed European Union. And if the Prime Minister had achieved his original objective, which he set out in his Bloomberg speech, of achieving fundamental and far-reaching reform, his words, then I would have been probably on the other side of this argument. But no one can remotely suggest that he has achieved fundamental and far-reaching reform. And if the leaders of the European Union were not prepared to engage with him on the question of fundamental and far-reaching reform when faced with the prospect of a Brexit, there is no chance whatever that they will consider that kind of reform if we vote to remain. A British vote to remain will be regarded by them as an enormous vote of confidence in their current arrangements. Their blindness to the flaws and failures of the European Union will continue. It will be reinforced. They will say, we can carry on our merry way. There's no more threat of a British exit. The British have voted to move in. Let's full steam ahead. So I think the questioner has hit on a very, very important point. There is not a cat's chance in hell of significant reform if we vote to remain. If we vote to leave, could just conceivably be a wake-up call for them.
Could I take another question from the floor? And I will take it from the front row here, gentlemen. There's a mic coming from your right.
Francis Hall. Dominic Grieve mentioned earlier the difficulties that European Union leaders have with their electorate. They have had 5 significant difficulties with Denmark, with France, with the Netherlands, and twice with Ireland. On each of those occasions, those countries have voted against further integration. On 2 of those occasions, their votes were ignored and the same integrationist treaty was imposed without another one. On 3, including twice with Ireland, they were told to vote again. How does that suggest that anything short of voting to leave the European Union will change the integrationist juggernaut?
Dominic?
Now here it seems to me that we are in danger perhaps of just running away with ourselves a little bit. I mean, the Irish electorate chose to change its mind. I thought that was part of the democratic process. And in those circumstances, the sort of characterization of venom which came from the person who asked the question seems to me to be just a little over the top. Of course, as in any treaty relationship, there are power issues, and I accept that. The world is not a perfect place. I've been in politics long enough to see the imperfections in the system, including the imperfections in one's own party or in other people's parties, or the imperfections in the way one's run affairs. But the EU has, I have to say, also, to an extent, listened to some of the objections that were raised, and actually the current characterization, which was made earlier, of an entity which is driving towards federalism, it strikes me as being a fantasy. Certainly it's a fantasy from everything I saw when I was in political office, and I believe it is a fantasy. It is in any case incapable of being realized in view of the views of the electorate, largely throughout the European Union states, the possible exception of Luxembourg. So, it just doesn't seem to me to be a realistic characterization of its working. The United Kingdom, if I may say, has a perfect right to leave. We don't even need a referendum to invoke Article 50, as all of you in this room will know. So if really these hideous, monstrous conspiracy that is being characterized by the questioner start to develop, then I'll simply say to my colleagues in government, use Article 50. It's as simple as that, because that's what our sovereignty allows us to do. Countries make their own choices.
Well, let's make our choice.
Now, I think there was a lady in the...
Can I just put a question to Dominic?
Indeed, Lord Howard.
If as he says, there's no drive towards federalism, why is it that every other member state of the European Union remains totally committed to the principle of ever closer union? Every single one of them.
Most countries within the European Union put a very different interpretation on the wording of ever closer union from us, and it was because of that that David Cameron secured in the Brussels Agreement a clear statement that ever closer union, according to the United Kingdom interpretation, was different from the way they interpret it. I greatly welcome that. It was a very sensible move, and it was actually part of a rather sensible, but not enormously significant, but nevertheless sensible agreement. But they do. They interpret it completely differently. And I have to say, Michael, when I go over to France, where I know lots of people, I don't get the impression France is about to subordinate itself to a European superstate.
But it is. The French president has actually suggested that the Eurozone should be a political entity with a binding parliament and a binding court, and that would mean giving up French sovereignty. You may not get that impression, but that's what President Hollande has said.
Michael, President Hollande and the views of the French people are not one and the same. I am quite satisfied. That the French are not about to subordinate themselves into a European federal superstate, nor indeed do I believe it's going to happen anywhere. I mean, you go and talk to the Danes, and you go and talk to the Netherlands, and you go and talk to the Swedes and the Poles. And the idea of the Poles subordinating themselves to a European superstate is laughable.
Now, I'm just going to take a question. I think there was a lady in the back row who had her hand up earlier.
Sarah Mackin. I just would like to spend some time for a minute on the 24th of June. And if we consider that we do vote to leave, I understand that there has to be a vote in Parliament. And I would just be interested in the views of the panel as to whether they believe that members of Parliament would actually vote for Brexit. And I'm particularly interested in the views of the Remain side of the debate.
I'm going to start with Lord Howard, and then I will move over.
I think members of Parliament would have to respect the views of the British people as expressed in the referendum, whatever the referendum decides.
Thank you. Dominic?
Yes, of course we would. It's quite clear. And actually leaving the EU and invoking Article 50 doesn't need a vote of Parliament. Because it's an international treaty so it could be done by the government without Parliament's consent. But it's right that Parliament would have to follow up with legislation dealing with the consequences of it. As a parliamentarian, I entirely accept that we would have to accept the will of the public and try to put together some Brexit arrangement for our future. And your question may raise the question as to exactly what that relationship should be. Doubtless that will be argued out endlessly in the House of Parliament and in the House of Commons particularly over the coming months. Whether the current Parliament survives that length of time if we vote for Brexit for it to be completed, I think is unlikely, because I happen to think that if we vote for Brexit, I think probably this Parliament's days are numbered.
Joanna?
Well, I think it's likely that Parliament would respect the views of the electorate. I also think that there's not the inbuilt majority for, or the safe majority for Remain that people sometimes think there is in the House of Commons, judging from the fact that you can hear a pin drop whenever any Conservative backbencher says something positive about Europe addressed to the Prime Minister, my very strong impression is that there are many more Conservative MPs who want to leave than are actually perhaps coming straight out and saying that. But I do have one caveat, and it's from a Scottish angle, which probably won't surprise you. One of the arguments that was made most forcefully during the referendum in Scotland was that the only way that Scotland could remain in the European Union was to vote to remain part of the United Kingdom. I know this because it was what got me out of my armchair and stopped me being an armchair nationalist. And I set up an organisation called Lawyers for Yes, and we campaigned around issues of why we felt Scotland would remain in the European Union, and we put forward opinions from distinguished neutrals or indeed unionists such as David Edwards QC and my colleague Aidan O'Neill QC as to why it was likely an independent Scotland would remain in the European Union. And we were widely rubbished. And opinion polls in Scotland show consistently that a significant majority of Scots wish to remain part of the European Union. So if Scotland is faced with a situation where people who live in Scotland, and I don't mean the Scots, I mean the people who live in Scotland, our electorate, have voted to remain in Europe, and we are facing being taken out of Europe against our will, then Scottish MPs will have quite a lot to say about that. And I know from talking to people on the doorsteps during our recent Holyrood election that it is very likely that opinion in Scotland will swing towards the need for a second independence referendum. So much as it pains me to agree with John Major, although I have a lot of respect for John Major, and much as it pains me to agree with Tony Blair, I think it's true that if there is a leave vote, then the issue of Scottish independence will very much be back on the table.
Thank you. Another question from the floor? Gentleman over here.
May I ask a question about Michael Howard's levers of control, or democracy, and the European Parliament? I'm Mark Batchelor. I'm a former candidate for the European Parliament, London North East, in 1984. The numbers of people who know their MEP is very low indeed. The turnout is very low indeed. You have a massive continental list system of 8, 10 members because Europe abolished the constituencies and so on. So that's why they're not democratic. They don't operate surgeries and so on like our MPs do. So what are you going to do, the inners, to make the European Parliament elections in this country democratic?
Dominic,
Well,
democracy.
Two things. Firstly, although I think the European Parliament plays an important role in order holding the Commission under scrutiny, I don't actually think the European Parliament is the key mechanism within the EU. In my view, it's the Council of Ministers, and it is through that the chain of accountability comes back to national parliaments. And I actually think that's as it should be. And I think actually one of the wrong turns of the the way Europe developed, partly actually prompted by the United Kingdom, rather bizarrely, was in placing greater emphasis on the Commission and the Parliament's role. But that's not to say that the Parliament doesn't have a role. As for how the Parliament should be elected, my view is that the current system confers very little legitimacy on it, partly because it uncouples entirely the MEPs from the areas in which they represent. And I myself would have liked to see a reversion to a system that established that link again.
Lord Howard, any comments on that?
Well, I mean, the basic flaw from my point of view, from our point of view, is that however many members of the European Parliament we have from the United Kingdom, they can consistently be outvoted, and they very often are.
Well, I know how he feels as a Scottish MP.
Another question from the floor. Gentleman over here.
Michael Darcy. Lord Howard, you explained to us why we could take comfort from the self-interest of all the other EU states in doing deals after we've left, because why would they cut off their nose to spite their face? But what about the point that they might do a bad deal with Britain, from Britain's point of view, in order to deter anybody else from taking a similar approach and thinking it can do better outside?
Look, we will not be a supplicant. We are the 5th biggest economy in the world. Everybody wants access to our country. Everybody wants a share in our economy, in our market. So it is ludicrous to suppose, even if some of the political leaders wanted to do that, what do you think the bosses of BMW would say to Chancellor Merkel if she was inclined to punish us by imposing some kind of deal which would affect the exports of BMWs into the UK? What do you think the French farmers would say to President Hollande if he was minded to do some kind of deal which impeded the export of French food and wine to this country? We're their biggest market. We are the biggest market of the rest of the European Union. So even if the leaders, misguided as they often are, were of a mind to punish us, their electorates, their business leaders would make it plain to them that they would not put up with the kind of damage to them that such an attitude would cause.
Joanna?
Well, it's not ludicrous to say that a Brexit could cause serious damage and pose serious problems for future trade deals. Lord Howard keeps mentioning the automobile industry, so let's take that as an example. Boris Johnson and I think Lord Howard this evening have said we'll get a good trade deal with the European Union because the Germans are desperate to sell us BMWs. But what he doesn't say, and what they don't tell us, is that our exports to the European Union are 13% of our economy, while their exports to us are only 3% of their economy. So we would be the big losers from a trade war. We need them more than they need us. And what you also don't hear from the leavers is that major foreign firms like Nissan set up shop in Britain because we are a gateway to sell vehicles to the whole of the European Union. If we quit the European Union, it's very likely that other countries in the Union will try to take those jobs away from us by luring companies away from the United Kingdom. Now, Nissan is a major employer in the north of England. To lose it would be a catastrophe for an area that has already suffered a great hardship as a result of past downturns in the British economy.
Martin?
This is fantasy. We export into the other member states of the European Union approximately £150 billion of goods per year, according to the latest figures. We import from them £68 billion more goods. Therefore, it is in neither party's interests to have a scenario in which tariffs or non-tariff barriers impede trade between us and them, but it is even more against their interests than it is against our interests. And whatever the European Union leaders are now saying in attempts to backdoor influence the referendum debate in this country, and whatever they might say in a hissy fit on the 24th of June, they are going to reflect economic realities. They are going to reflect the fact that, with the exception of Germany or one or two other of the northern economies, the Eurozone economies are in deep recession with very high unemployment. They cannot afford to cut off access to a major export market such as we are, and it is simply absurd, I think, to suppose that politicians at the end of the day would refuse mutually advantageous trade terms out of some sort of absurd political spite.
Dominic?
When we've invoked Article 50, which is the only way of properly leaving the EU, we will be engaged in a negotiating period of 2 years with 27 member states, some of which export hardly anything to this country at all. And they will have to reach unanimity about our continuing participation in trading with them and the terms on which that takes place. That seems to me to be, at the very least, rather fertile territory for difficulties which rather undermine the case that Michael has just been making. Furthermore, the single market provides us with protection that a trade agreement cannot. There are plenty of examples in the past of the use of various mechanisms to restrict or to create protectionism. We had to go, for example, to the Commission to complain when the French wouldn't have beef long after the BSE crisis was over. They will use their power to protect themselves in exactly the same way, making trade more difficult. And that just brings the other point, which is that in my constituency, I have all these American companies who are here because of the single market access to the EU. Of course, we can argue that they'll continue to get access, but there is a risk that they will not. Back in the 1960s, as was pointed out to me by a French businessman, 50% of the top 100 American companies had their European headquarters in Paris. There is not a single one left there, because they've all come here under a combination of two things: wise economic and fiscal policies, Mrs. Thatcher, and our membership of the EU. We are about to remove one of the pillars of certainty on which they have based themselves here. And that, I think, is a very considerable risk to our economic well-being.
Dominic, you know perfectly well those are exactly the arguments which were used to try and get us into the euro. We were told inward investment would completely dry up if we weren't in the euro. We were told the City of London would collapse if we weren't in the euro, and they were wrong about that, and they're wrong in the predictions that you've just made.
I never favoured joining the euro, and while some may have made such predictions, it seemed to me they were of a very different nature and quality, because our access to the single market continued, notwithstanding the fact that we didn't participate in the eurozone.
I'm going to take another question. The lady there whose hand has been up for, thank you. Yep.
Hi, my name is Amy Wilson. I'm a bar student. My question is about the rule of law and human rights and democracy. I think it was Dominic or Joanne that said the EU has brought peace to Europe and it's promoted women's rights and things like that. But I'm really troubled by the authoritarian governments in Hungary, Poland, Turkey, that the EU doesn't seem to be doing anything about. And in terms of, women's rights and rights for gay people, there's plenty of countries in Europe that just don't respect that. So whilst I think, I can't really follow any of your economic arguments on either side, but I think the rights argument is troubling. I wonder what you had to say about that. Thanks.
Dominic, do you want to?
I worry very much about the slide towards authoritarianism in some EU states. And I worry very much. One of the challenges for the EU has been taking and absorbing countries which do not have strong rule of law traditions. But the fact that ultimately the EU is underpinned by the principles of the European Convention on Human Rights, another subject, is rather important. And so to that extent, I think the EU has been a powerful moderating force. My concern, which I share with you, is simply but I would also add that I think that if the situation, we didn't have the disciplines of the EU, I think the situation might be very much worse. So to that extent, the EU, although imperfectly, has nevertheless fulfilled what seems to me to be an important part of one of its principal aims, which was to create an area in which the rule of law can develop.
Lord Howard, the EU and the rule of law?
Well, in the countries which the questioner named, she was quite right. The EU isn't working. It's just not working. It's not having the effect that it's supposed to have. No answer to that question.
Catch Joanna? Yeah.
I just want to come in on that. I think some of the countries, at least one of the countries the questioner named, Turkey, is not actually in the European Union, but Hungary is. And I accept the point that's being made that some of the newer members perhaps don't live up to the standards we would expect. We need to remember that many of these newer members came from the former communist bloc and don't come from the tradition of rule of law ideas that's so deeply embedded in countries such as the member states of the United Kingdom and also some other of the more westernized democracies in the European Union. However, what I would say about countries like Hungary is better out than in. And also there is an issue. We like to think of ourselves in the United Kingdom as being steeped in the tradition of the rule of law. But at the present, we have a government that is has various parts of it. It's a very divided government, but we have a Home Secretary who recently said she wanted to withdraw the United Kingdom from the European Convention on Human Rights. We have a preponderance of people in the government who want to repeal the Human Rights Act, and we have a very significant number of people who want to leave the European Union and take a very dim view of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So when a union of nations such as the United Kingdom, which aspects of it like to think of themselves as the cradle of the rule of law, are behaving in such a cavalier fashion towards the rule of law, then I do think we are sending out a very bad example to these newer democracies, and we need to look to the example that we are sending out to them. Every time Britain bangs the drum about withdrawing from the ECHR or repealing the Human Rights Act, it is grist to the mill of Russia and other elements in Eastern Europe who don't like the rule of law and don't really respect our democratic norms. So we need to look at our behaviour as well as theirs.
Martin, any thoughts?
Yes, indeed. And I'd be very interested to have a fascinating debate which could go on all evening on the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a subject I'm very interested in, and Joanne and Dominic are. But we're talking about the European Union tonight. And let's consider the fact that the European Union regulates its own fundamental rights, and the Court of Justice of the European Union sitting in Luxembourg is the court that decides upon the scope and application of those rights. And it is not the case that it is a friend of those who want to see enhanced human rights. Let me give you one particular and very worrying example. It is a case called Meloni. It was about the use of the European arrest warrant to arrest an Italian national in Spain when he had been convicted in his absence by an Italian court. And the Spanish constitution provided a safeguard against the extradition to other countries of people convicted in their absence of offences abroad. The Luxembourg court said that he could not invoke any right under the Charter of Fundamental Rights to prevent his deportation back to Italy under the arrest warrant. The interests of the European Union in the operation of this EU instrument overrode those rights. And that is what we will see increasingly if we leave fundamental rights in the hands of the Luxembourg court.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to take two more questions. Gentleman in the front here.
My question is specifically for Joanna. You talked about, a bit closer. You talked about the employment protections which the European Union provides. You described that as one of the key advantages. If a domestic government was elected, hypothetically, on a manifesto commitment to remove some of those employment protections, for whatever reason, would you endorse the European Union stepping in to prevent that from taking place? And if you would, can you really say that you believe in democracy?
Well, I believe in checks and balances, and one of the in a democracy, one of the things I've been most struck by since I've been elected as a member of the British Parliament is a strange narrow-mindedness that somehow the British Constitution, by which people usually mean English notions of sovereignty, and the English Constitution is superior to all others. I think the importance of human rights and instruments such as we have in the European Union and the ECHR is that they protect fundamental rights and they protect minorities. And I'm in favour of a constitution that has a constitutional court at its heart and certain fundamental values. And gender equality, for example, is a fundamental value of the European Union. I've no problem with that, and I'm very pleased that if some nasty right-wing government was elected on no doubt a minority of the vote, as the current right-wing government is elected, and with precious little votes in Scotland, that our fundamental rights as protected by the European Union and also the ECHR would prevent them from tearing up the law on employment protections and gender equality. I've no problem with that.
Another question? There's one right in the back row. Yep, I can take that one.
Sabella Chaliva, student from King's College. I'm just wondering, What model do you support for the UK outside of the EU?
I'm very sorry, could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you.
What model do you support for the UK outside of the EU?
Lord Howard?
A British model. You know, people compare us to Norway and Switzerland and so on. Norway's got 5 million people. Switzerland's got 8 million people. We've got 65 million people. We will have a British model, and we will be an independent, self-governing democracy with trading arrangements with many other countries in the world, including the European Union. And let me ask you to reflect on this point. There are many groups of countries in other parts of the world who have come together to cooperate, particularly in relation to trade. You have NAFTA, obviously, in North America. You have Mercosur in South America. You have ASEAN in Asia. You even have the African Union. Not a single one of them has chosen to follow the model of the European Union. Not one of them. And the reason is that none of those countries, not one of them, is prepared to give up the basic rights to self-government, making their court subordinate to a foreign court, making their parliaments subordinate to some foreign body. None of them are prepared to give up that degree of self-government. So there are plenty of models for us to look for in the rest of the world, and we'll end up with a British model which will be the best in the interests of our country and its people.
Martin, do you want to add anything to that?
No.
Right, in which case I think I will wrap it up and ask each of the speakers to give us up to 2 minutes of concluding remarks. Dominic?